Once you've found a mobile home park to buy, once you actually have made an agreement, now you want to put it under contract. You want to make it official. You want to go from dating to marriage. And so that's what we're going to spend our time on this video is reviewing the important details on putting together a purchase contract. Yes, your lawyer will help you, but you need to know most of the major terms and know what to push for and what to talk to your lawyer about when you're putting this deal together. Because you can lose a ton of money if you're not thinking about the purchase contract in the right way and protecting yourself, your capital, and ultimately your earnest money to reserve the right to go through due diligence and closing to actually purchase this mobile home park. Buying real estate is not like buying a stock. You actually have to go through a bunch of paperwork and diligence and the loan process to close the actual deal. And that requires a very detailed schedule, which we're going to start with that. Just zooming out, what does this process look like? And then we'll back up and go through the individual steps and what's important here. In terms of what needs to happen before day zero, it kind of depends. My preference was to send the purchase agreement, the draft that we have was to send the purchase and sale agreement, our template, to send it with the details of the property in the agreement as part of the negotiation. So once we agreed on rough terms, I would send the contract. Some other people will send what's called a letter of intent, an LOI, which is a 1 to 2 page simple document that just lays out the business terms. I like to just do that verbally or via email, right? Because what you don't want to have happen is between the time you're going back and forth with the seller on terms and pricing, somebody else to come in and swoop in on your deal. If you really like the purchase price, if this is an off-market transaction, I try to get this thing moving as soon as possible, and I try to control the contract negotiation with our document. So if you're sending that quickly, you typically are leading the charge on the negotiations of that purchase and sale agreement. So day zero, you get the contract signed, which is great, and we're going to talk about the terms that go in there. But you get it signed, but let's talk about the timeline first. Then you have the earnest money check is due, right? That you have to wire some money to escrow. That's the title company. They're going to hold that money and they're going to ultimately handle the closing of this transaction. That usually happens within a week. Then you have a 30-day, ideally 60 days, but 30 is pretty common to do due diligence. And then after that, once you've cleared due diligence, you go into the financing period. So you have a financing contingency, hopefully, where you try to figure out if you can get the lender on board to close this property. And then the money goes hard once that period ends. Sometimes the money might go hard after the due diligence period, but it just depends on what you can negotiate. And then closing ultimately might happen anywhere from 60 to 90 days is pretty typical. Loans, especially with Fannie and Freddie today, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are taking a bit longer, so you want to add buffer, which we'll talk about. But I like to start with a critical closing date. Sometimes if there's a broker involved, they will help you with this. They put together a transaction, a schedule with all the relevant people involved, their contact information, and a deadline schedule. I think this is a nice touch. The best brokers tend to do this. If they don't, you might have somebody on your team, or you might want to put this together yourself and share it with the seller just so everybody's on the same page. I think it's great that everybody knows exactly what the expectations are, what the timelines are. That way there's no ambiguity. All right. So backing up, what do we think about when we start negotiating one of these things? I always wanted to get the contract in the seller's hands as soon as possible and drive that process. Right? That's this concept of first to provide wins. So if you get the contract out first, you're driving the process. They're using your template and they're negotiating off of that. Sometimes they will just sign it, which is amazing. But if they're sophisticated, they have their own lawyer involved. You're going to have to go through this process of back and forth. It's called a red line, where they're sending the contract with their markups back to you and your lawyer for your processing and hopefully your acceptance or denial and tweaking back to them. And then maybe you accept it, maybe you deny the red line, and then you could send it back to them. And you go back and forth like that for a while, playing ping pong. Ideally, you do that very quickly because time kills deals, right? The longer you're letting this go, you're getting increased legal bills from your lawyer. It's dragging out. Sometimes the seller just says, this is too much of a hassle. I'll go with a different buyer. So you want to make that relatively quickly. You don't want to be the one holding up that process. When you get a red line back, a contract that's marked up, you want to fire it back as fast as you can. Get on the phone with your lawyer if you need to. Once I got really comfortable with this process, once I had done the 50th contract, I I tended to just mark up some of the basic stuff myself. I'm not advising you do that without a lawyer, but if you are running on a shoestring budget, you're just starting out, that is something that you might want to do for just a very small type of tweak in a contract. Once again, this is not legal advice, but I certainly know a lot of groups that will do that, or they'll have their in-house lawyer obviously drive the process, which really speeds things up. This section, meaty enough, that just means have enough protections in there. You want to assume the worst case scenarios. It's kind of funny, it's kind of funny because when you buy a property or you sell a property to some group and you get their contract back and it's like 70, 80 pages, that that group has probably seen a lot of things go wrong. I think that's overkill. I think that actually kills some deals because some sellers, especially mom and pops, are just going to see that and get overwhelmed. I tend to like something a much more modest from a size standpoint because most of the information of these contracts is just the extreme outlier risk that you're trying to protect from. But there's other things, there's other structural things in place to protect your money, your earnest money, and to protect you as a buyer, and that is the ability to cancel the deal and just get your earnest money deposit back. Or worst case scenario, the liquidated damages, the damages to you if you don't follow through on your side of the contract is you lose your earnest money, right? Which might only be $20,000 if it's a small deal. And so that's your worst case scenario. So you want to have those types of protections. As you get larger and you have more at risk, maybe your contracts get a little more involved. But once again, you got to balance this with what the seller can actually handle. They might have a small town lawyer that they're working with who's not going to be able to negotiate an 80-page Wall Street type of law firm purchase and sale agreement. So just food for thought. And the last point in here, yeah, sure, you want to have the attorney review, especially if you're very new at this, you're not a professional. You're going to feel a lot better if you have somebody professional actually going through the purchase and sale agreement. There's some templates online. I don't recommend using those. You tend to want to have a pro on your side advising you. And here's the components, right? The earnest money, talked about that. That's to reserve the deal. That's so the seller feels good that you're not just wasting his time. Due diligence period, financing, warranties, prorations, and closing. Those are the major sections of the purchase and sale agreement. Okay, we talked about this in concept. I'm not going to fire through on all these. Just the main points here is you want to keep them out reasonable. Obviously, the lowest possible amount that they'll agree to is what you want to go with. You want it to be your right and your only right to refund it. Ideally, you don't want to have them sign to release your earnest money deposit. Some title companies will require that both the seller and the buyer sign that release. Ideally, you don't want that. Ideally, you just want to say, hey, look, I hate this deal. I want to get my money back. And they'll wire it to you shortly. Do not send this thing directly to the seller. There are some states, unfortunately, where it's a lawyer closing instead of title. And so, yes, in those states, you might actually have to send the earnest money to their lawyer, but that's certainly better than sending it directly to the seller in their bank account. And they can just abscond with it or drag it out and never send it back. So be smart about where you're sending the money. And those are the big things with earnest money deposit. Oh, and the range here, the 10K to 200K, obviously $200,000 is going to be a much larger deal. That's going to be a private equity type of purchase typically, where you're talking about something like a $20 million deal, maybe 10 if you just have a seller that's really skittish about working with a particular buyer. And this can be a weapon for you, right? Not every group can afford or is willing to put up $200,000 at risk, even though it's only, quote, at risk in escrow for 30 days. But a lot of groups don't want to do that. So that could be a weapon when you're making your purchase offers, is to use a higher earnest money deposit. Okay, due diligence period, 14 days is the lowest I've seen. I'm sure there's deals that happen in 7 days they're using hard money lenders that are quite small. Maybe the person can close all cash and they just feel like they have a screamer deal and they don't care about due diligence. They don't have a lender involved, so they do it in a week. I do not advise against that. These things take time. There's a lot of paperwork to check. There's a lot of infrastructure to go look at. There's surveys, there's all kinds of stuff. But 14 is probably the quickest you can do it. If you have a team, you've done this before and it's a smaller deal. 30 days is pretty standard and 45 to 60 days is ideal. I would certainly push for that. Critical due diligence provisions to go. The critical provisions to negotiate on due diligence. You don't want to have to defend what you find in diligence. You want to be able to cancel for any reason. This trigger clause, this is kind of an insider mobile home park tactic. Oftentimes you have the financing period, or oftentimes you have the due diligence period start when you are in receipt of all of the financial due diligence when you are in receipt of all of the due diligence documents. So you might give the seller a lengthy list. You might put it in the exhibit of every single item that you need for diligence, or you can send it to them after they sign the purchase contract. That tends to be a more effective tool because sometimes they get scared when they see this giant exhibit with 100 different items that they need to send the buyer. But if it's spelled out in your contract that list is part of that list, receiving those files is when the clock starts. That actually really extends how long this diligence period might be. Because if you can imagine, a lot of mom and pop sellers, they don't have beautifully organized Dropbox folders with every subfolder and every document they could possibly need for diligence in there and teed up. Sometimes it's a shoebox of receipts. Sometimes they have to go and track down all the bank statements. Sometimes they have an office full of paperwork. They have to somehow figure out how they're going to scan it and get it to you. So this can take a lot longer than you might think. So if you are trying to sell a park, watch out for this clause. I would make sure you get the due diligence list from the buyer in your exhibit of the purchase and sale agreement. That way you know what you're expected to send over. And then I would try to make sure that you're negotiating that as part of the contract. So it's not an unreasonable list, and therefore you're extending this diligence period. And here's that exact clause you might find in a contract if you're selling a park to a professional operator. This is that common language that talks about after a receipt, that talks about the clock starting for diligence after the receipt of all those files. So something to think about including, or something to look out for if you're selling. Financing contingency. Now, normally in a large transaction, when you're working with two professional groups, the financing contingency isn't as solid as you might like it to be. You're giving up, normally you know by kind of 30, 45 days in whether or not you have a lender on board. So a lot of times sellers want you to go hard, which means your earnest money is non-refundable before you actually know that that loan is going to be closed. If you're working with a mom and pop seller and it's a smaller deal, I would strongly advise trying to make sure that the contract gives you the out if the lender doesn't perform. So you might have a financing contingency that goes all the way up until like a week prior to close. That's ideal because when you're working with a small regional bank, a credit union, they can get spooked by big market swings, big headlines in the Wall Street Journal, and they might decide to just not do your loan. And there you are with your earnest money at risk, and you've spent a lot of time and effort and other capital doing the due diligence work, paying for experts, paying for consultants to analyze the property. And so there's a lot at risk. And so ideally, you want to be able to back out of the deal if the loan doesn't come through. And I've had this happen to me. The first deal that I worked on, I asked the seller for a 2-week extension because the bank just wasn't on board. I didn't have this lengthy financing contingency in the contract, and the seller said, no, we're not giving you an extra 2 weeks. So you want to have contingencies and extensions on the loan because loans don't go as smoothly as you think most of the time. You're working with a lender, you're working with their junior lending people that are doing loan due diligence. They sometimes don't move very fast. They get bogged down with other loans. There's not a lot of incentive for them to process this information quickly, and they have a lot of career risk if they make a mistake. So loans don't happen fast. So therefore, you want to put a lot of extra time and options to extend, if possible, in your financing contingency, in your loan timing. All right. Okay. Because that is such a hassle working with a large bank, or especially CMBS, which is a Wall Street bank, or Fannie Mae, which is an agency, because it is so painful, it's always great if you can get seller financing, which is the seller carrying a note and being the lender himself or herself. And one last thing, you want to try to have this ability to extend the financing contingency period just in case a lender decides to back out. Sometimes if the lender backs out, it's not at the last day, right? Lenders, they tend to close deals. I mean, 85, 90% of lenders, once they get past a certain point in the process and they're spending real money on their own due diligence, they typically close. But they can back out. And if it's early in the process, lots of times you sign a term sheet with the lender, and a week later, once they send somebody to the property, they said, "Oh, wait a minute, we don't actually want to do the loan here on this asset," which is another tip. Send them a video of the property, right? Send them as many pictures as you can if you don't have a video. You want them to be very comfortable with the asset that they're going to lend on and not be surprised on their lender trip, which tends to be a check the box thing for them. But you want them to do that early in the process, and you would ideally like them to know exactly what this asset looks like before you go down, too far down the process with them. Because if you have more time in the deal, if you have flexibility in the contract, you can switch lenders. And if you have a seller that's reasonable, which most are, you can tell them, "Hey, our lender backed out. Here's the letter we received from them. We're going to need an extra 30 days." That's not a great conversation to have, but you could probably do that once in a process with most sellers. Not all, but I would say, I don't know, 60, 70% of sellers are fairly reasonable, have worked with lenders before, know what a pain in the rear it can be. And they also don't want to restart this process if possible. That might be different if they've been getting higher offers, right, over this 30, 60 days while you're in diligence and trying to get your loan. If they've been receiving offers from other people that found out that this transaction might be happening, uh, then then the seller might not be as patient. They might be hoping for you to fall on your face and not close the deal. And so that's a quick tip to keep things quiet, right? When things are under contract and you haven't closed. Reps and warranties. This is the fun section of the contract where basically the seller and the buyer are representing certain things about who they are, who their entity is, that that they're good people, that they're going to follow through on certain things. And so you can save most of this for the lawyer to handle. But the big ones here are just making sure that you're not taking on existing agreements that you're not aware of when you take over the asset, required to assume all their employees or all of their contracts that they have in place with different vendors. You want to make sure that the seller has repped to clean title. There's not a lot of clouds on title. There's not some random lien from either a mechanic, a vendor, or a prior lender that you weren't aware of on title. That's going to make it a hassle for you to get clean title. Environmental, pretty self-explanatory. You're going to get a phase one, which is a get out of jail free card if there happens to be an environmental problem that you weren't aware of. You want them, to the extent possible, to rep that it is a clean property. They haven't been dumping toxic waste all over the property the last 10 years. Financial accuracy. I mean, they're gonna qualify all these things and say, yes, we're giving you all this financial information and it is accurate to the best of our knowledge. You'll see that phrase a ton in contracts, to the best of our knowledge, which just means they're not doing it maliciously. So a lot of these things with contracts are just within reason. This is not an ironclad document, right? This is not, take it to the bank and it's good no matter what. It's a handshake. It's a formal version of a handshake, right? People can decide, you know what? I don't care what's on the contract. I've seen older sellers who just don't care. They're just saying, no, I'm not going to do it. And then you have to pursue legal actions against them. So it is protections for sure. Most of the time it works out. 95% of the time it's going to be fine. And buyers and sellers are going to agree to and perform what's in the contract. But every once in a while you get some weird outliers. So it's just nice to know that, some of these things have at least been represented, that they're actually an ethical person and they're giving you correct information. Permits and zoning is a big one, but your due diligence is going to flush this out anyways. You're going to get the permit. You're going to get a zoning report, ideally, for a professional that's going to literally go to the city, who is either going to go to the city themselves and pull the files and talk to the city officials, or they're going to do it remotely and get you a nice clean report that gives you without doubt exactly what the zoning is and that you're permitted to have a mobile home park at this location, and then no pending litigation is pretty obvious. Okay, prorations and closings. This has to do with that crazy ledger-looking document you get from title. We like First American, but there's every title company has its own version of this document that is literally just a ledger from the buyer and seller's perspective on the amount of monies that are going back and forth and being credited at closing, right? So you're prorating the rents that are coming in. You're prorating the utility bills that have already been paid for the month, even though you're closing on the 15th. That way you actually need to be splitting those costs. So this can be a real bummer at the end of a transaction after you've been grinding for 60, sometimes 90 days to get this deal done, and then you're fighting over seemingly small dollars to get this accurate at the very end. But you just want somebody that is on top of this at closing, and therefore you want it to tie to the purchase contract so there's no doubt on who gets what, because you don't want to be arguing with the seller at on the 1 yard line before this thing closes, yeah, over who's supposed to get the last couple of days of rent for a particular month, or whether or not you round it up to the end of the month. Because you just don't want to be fighting with the seller over small dollars at the very end of the deal if it wasn't spelled out in the contract. Spelling things out in the contract just saves a lot of hassles at the end. You just, once again, don't want any ambiguity. You want the least amount of ambiguity as possible in all things regarding a transaction. Okay, so what happens if people are not all right, so what happens if people aren't holding up their end of the bargain? What happens if the seller is flaking on you? They just disappear. Well, you have some rights as the buyer. You can sue them for specific performance typically. So you're going to want to have that. So you're going to want to have that contract. So you are going to want to have that clause in your contract that says what the damages are if the seller doesn't perform. And specific performance means they have to sell you the property. So that's a big one, because you might have a ton of money and effort and time into this deal. You want to be able to follow through and actually purchase it. You want them to have to show up at closing and sign the paperwork and transfer title to you. But it's ideal if you do not have specific performance on your side of the contract as the buyer. You want your downside in this transaction to be your earnest money. You want that to be your liquidated damages. Fine, you don't adhere to your side of the bargain. You don't close the deal, and it's 3 days from closing. Fine, take my earnest money. Sorry, it didn't work out. That's what you want, because that gives you the most optionality when you're trying to buy a mobile home park. Maybe you didn't raise the equity. Maybe you came in not having the equity lined up, and you lined up the loan. You went through diligence, but you came up short on the equity, which would be horrible. I don't recommend that. Try to have an idea where that money's coming from before you go through all this this hoop jumping. But it's always good to have that optionality to back out and know exactly what your losses are going to be versus having to follow through and actually buy the thing if you don't have the money or the lender backed out. So that's a big one. Make sure you get that in there. And then assignment rights. Assignment rights are interesting if you are starting out, you're kind of new to this space and you don't have the funds yet to pull off a multi-million-dollar sale. If you're buying, a medium-sized park, or if you want to start chasing the bigger parks, 100-pad park, perhaps that's a $7 to $12 million deal, depending on how great the location is and how high lot rents are. Maybe you don't have that kind of capital. Maybe you're not going to qualify for that large of a loan for a deal that size. And so maybe you want to tie up the deal and then actually assign it to a group like ours that's been in the business a long time, that works on a lot of markets and can close the deal. Maybe you want to take an assignment fee for that. Maybe you want to roll an assignment fee into equity so you can start building up some long-term equity. This is a way to get into the space without having all of the capital and all of the experience and the balance sheet to qualify for a loan. This is an entry to the space, and I've seen a lot of operators enter the mobile home park investing world exactly through this channel, talking to sellers, talking to mobile home park owners, getting them to agree to a purchase price, tying the deal up with a purchase contract, and then having a very specific clause in the contract that says you can assign the contract to somebody else. Now, a smart seller and their lawyer is going to say, no, you cannot just tie this thing up and give it to whoever you want. You can assign it to an entity that you own and control. That's typically what you see in these contracts, which makes sense. If you're selling your asset, you don't want the quote buyer to just give it to anybody else. You want to know who you're dealing with. And so you would want this clause in that contract if you're selling. But as the buyer, you're going to need this flexibility because the lender might want you to change something about the entity. Maybe you end up partnering with a group, and so the LLC name is going to be different. So you want this flexibility to change the entity name, and ideally it's without any restrictions, but most of the time you're going to have it be tied to your individual ownership. But most of the time, you're also going to have to be the owner of that new entity, or at least be the managing principal. Okay, so this slide's talking about when you're through due diligence and you start finding things you don't like. You start finding surprises, which you're going to find things you don't like. There's no perfect deal. There's no perfect diligence process. The art of diligence is knowing exactly what to overlook. So the art of diligence, the art and science of diligence is knowing everything and chasing down as many details as possible, and then having the experience and wisdom to know what to ignore, right? But there's some things you can't ignore. If the pipes are falling apart and that's going to be a $200,000, $250,000 thing, you're probably going to want to go back to the seller and say, hey, look at this report from our engineer. They scoped the lines. They're saying that these things are falling apart and there's all kinds of bellies in these pipes and the water pipes are leaking, and we're going to have to spend this amount of money to replace it. Now, the seller might tear that up in your face and say, I don't care. The price is what the price is. But there's a lot of sellers that are reasonable, and they tend to know their parks pretty well. They tend to know that, yeah, I should have replaced the pipes a while ago and just didn't want to spend the money. So fine, we'll give you that credit, or maybe we'll meet you in the middle. And I don't like to do, and piece of advice, don't do this incrementally. Don't do, 250 one week, 100 the next week when things pop up. You want to kind of wait, not the day before you're supposed to go hard, right? Non-refundable on your deposit. That pisses sellers off. You want to do it the week before, right? Getting closer to when you know that money is going to be at risk. You don't want to spring it on them when they think they have a done deal. You want to give them some time to, okay, fine, right? You don't want them in an emotional state. Ideally, you have a broker involved that is helping with this process because they want to see the deal done at this point, right? The broker weirdly is kind of on both people's teams the further you get into the contract timeline, right? Because they care about the commission. They care about this thing closing. They don't want to start brand new with a new buyer and restart the clock to day zero. That's a hassle. They want to get this thing closed. And so they will try to be reasonable. They will try to advise their client, the seller, that, hey, you know what, these are pretty normal type of credits based on the information that they provided us. You may or may not get the seller to agree to that, but that's how the process works. And so I would always advise people. So my thing was always just focus on, and so my thing is just focusing on big ticket items. You don't want to nickel and dime a seller over some random diligence stuff that you find. You only want to focus on giant things that are really going to hurt your numbers because the math has to work, obviously, for you and your investors. But if you try to go after everything, you really run the risk of alienating the seller, pissing them off. Maybe they tear up the contract. Who knows? You don't want to risk a good deal over nickel and dime stuff. And then and so this closing checklist is not really part of the PSA, the contract process. You're going to have a lot of this information in your contract, but this is a nice reminder as you go through the closing items, which is usually a punch list of items you got to get through with your lawyer, that you're taking care of these. The big ones here are the mobile home park titles, right? If there are some park-owned homes that are being transferred to you, this is often a sticking point and something people kind of wait till the last minute. And then you realize the seller never had any of the titles. So I would get ahead of this one. The insurance policy in place, that's obviously a no-brainer. The lender's not going to let you get away with that. They're going to want to see the insurance policy is effective before they wire their money. They want to make sure that they're covered in the extremely unlikely event there's some sort of horrible weather event the day of closing. And some of these other things are pretty self-explanatory. You can spend some time on this checklist by pausing the video. But what the most important line item, I think, the most important sentence on this slide is you don't want to go with a first-time closer in this space. You'd like to work with people and experts that have done mobile home park transactions before. You want to go with people that have seen this 100 times, ideally. I mean, fine, if they've done 10, okay, that's better than none. Because there's weird quirks in this space versus buying an apartment building. You don't have to deal with mobile home park titles in buying an apartment building. So there's just some random things that ideally you want somebody advising you that has been there before. Okay, quick reminders is all right, quick critical reminders here. Try to use your contract. You're driving the process. Your lawyer's leading the charge, and then they're kind of coming off of the terms that you want, right? Because you're sending something that you would love, a perfect contract, right? If they just sign it, which sometimes they will, and then they're trying to chip away at your perfect contract. That's what you want the process to look like. Protect your capital. Obviously, don't sign up for an earnest money amount that's going to make you lose sleep at night, and put all kinds of protections in terms of getting that back under your release only, ideally, and lots of ways to get your money back if surprises pop up, and a lot of extensions in time, which is number 3, maximize your due diligence, and of course your financing contingency after that. 4, get things in writing. Obviously, clearly the contract's going to be in writing, but you also want exhibits. Sometimes people just punt the exhibits to closing, which you don't want to do that. Ideally, you want to put things up front about like the personal property list, right? Which is all the machinery, the tools that are at the property. Those are less important, but the more you can put in the contract, the more you can put in writing up front, the easier closing is going to go. Number 5, we talked about no specific performance. You as the buyer, you want your only risk in this deal, your earnest money if possible. And 6, try not to retrade. If you do have to, based on real big items, do so carefully and loop in the broker to actually get their help in trying to get these credits to you for legitimate things that popped up in due diligence. Okay, so that was a pretty detailed deep dive on a purchase contract, on how to negotiate a purchase and sale agreement for a mobile home park. So hopefully that was extremely helpful. And don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions. We're Vintage Capital. There's our website. And if you're enjoying this, make sure you watch the next video in this series.